get me the top 10. They're just what you think are the best 10. So he did. And Sinatra, Elvis, Ray Charles, Marvin Gaye.
Behind the bass lines that changed music forever stood a man who never stopped listening. Paul McCartney, the genius who helped create the Beatles, was shaped by the sounds that came before him.
This is love, you gotta give me more, give me more. Hey, hey, hey.
From Little Richard's screaming vocals to Buddy Holly's songwriting, McCartney studied other artists with deep respect.
Do you know the Korean pop band BTS?
Yeah.
Okay, they're the biggest thing on the planet right now.
So I've heard.
He once said Little Richard taught him everything he knows.
Yeah, I used to like doing Kansas City, Little Richard.
What a lot of people have covered.
While Buddy Holly showed him that musicians could write their own songs. These influences helped McCartney become one of music's greatest legends. Today we explore the bands and artists that made Paul McCartney the musician millions love. 10. The Everly Brothers. Coming in at number 10 are the Everly Brothers, the duo McCartney once called the greatest band to ever exist. Brothers Don and Phil Everly shaped how McCartney understood harmony and songwriting. When McCartney and John Lennon first heard songs like All I Have to Do Is Dream in 1958, it changed everything for them.
That burns within my heart for you, the good times we had.
McCartney said the biggest influence on him and Lennon was the Everly Brothers, and they wanted to be just like them.
Dave Edmunds said to me that the Everlys had asked him to produce a record. And he said he was just ringing around a lot of people.
When the young songwriters started creating music together, McCartney pretended to be Phil, while Lennon played the role of Don. The beautiful harmonies from two male voices showed them something new.
Another bunch of people you admire are the Everly Brothers.
Dave Edmunds, who's in the film Give My Guard to Broad Street that we just made.
Years later, in 1984, when the Everly Brothers reunited after breaking up, McCartney wrote a comeback song called On the Wings of a Nightingale. When Phil Everly died in 2014, McCartney wrote that he would always love him for giving him the sweetest musical memories of his life. 9. Chuck Berry. At number 9 is Chuck Berry, the man McCartney called a magician, who created music that was exotic yet normal at the same time.
Help me find the party, try to get in touch with me.
When the Beatles first heard the guitar intro to Sweet Little 16, they instantly became fans. McCartney said Berry's stories were more like poems than lyrics, especially songs like Johnny B. Good and Maybelline.
Chuck Berry is up next, yeah.
He's just a natural-born poet, he's just great.
Berry taught the Beatles so many things that led them into a dream world of rock and roll music. The band covered multiple Berry songs including Rock and Roll Music, Sweet Little 16, and Johnny B. Good during their early years. McCartney even borrowed the bass line from Berry's I'm Talking About You for the Beatles' classic I Saw Her Standing There. He played exactly the same notes and said it fit perfectly. McCartney met Berry in his hometown of St. Louis when he played there on tour and called it a memory he would cherish forever. Berry was one of rock and roll's greatest legends, and McCartney admitted it was impossible to sum up what he meant to all the young guys growing up in Liverpool. 8. Fats Domino. Number 8 brings us to Fats Domino, the New Orleans piano legend who thrilled McCartney and the Beatles in their early Liverpool days.
You cry when you said goodbye. Is that a shame?
Songs like Ain't That a Shame, Blueberry Hill, and I'm in Love Again introduced them to the sounds of New Orleans rock and roll. McCartney said Domino's voice, piano playing, and musical style was a huge influence on the Beatles. The band was excited to meet Domino once in his hometown of New Orleans in 1964.
I know, but I was a fan. I'm also very happy.
McCartney remembered that Domino was wearing a huge star-spangled diamond watch, which was their first encounter with what we now call bling. His appearance in the film The Girl Can't Help It was truly magnificent to them. McCartney was so influenced by Domino that when he sat down to write Lady Madonna in 1968, he started singing a Fats Domino impression. The boogie-woogie piano style took his voice to a very odd place. Domino later covered the song himself, making it his last charting single and completing a beautiful circle of musical respect. 7. Smokey Robinson. Coming in at number 7 is Smokey Robinson. The Motown legend McCartney once said was like God in the Beatles' eyes. This is one of the highest compliments McCartney ever gave another artist.
Second that emotion. Ooh, no, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Robinson's smooth vocals and brilliant songwriting from The Miracles deeply touched all 4 Beatles members. The band showed their love by covering Robinson's song, You Really Got a Hold on Me, for their album with the Beatles. John Lennon wrote, Not the Second Time, trying to sound like Smokey Robinson, while George Harrison later released a solo song called Pure Smokey as his tribute to the singer. Robinson met the Beatles before they became famous, when they were playing in a Liverpool club. He was flattered that John Lennon knew so much about his music and was already asking him questions about Miracle songs.
And then him is that famous guy.
Wow.
He's very famous.
Robinson said he loved that the Beatles were the first really popular white band who came right out, and said they grew up influenced by black music and Motown. The feeling of respect between them was mutual and created a lasting friendship. 6. Carl Perkins. At number 6 is Carl Perkins, the king of rockabilly, who wrote the classic Blue Suede Shoes. McCartney once made a powerful statement about Perkins, saying that if there were no Carl Perkins, there would be no Beatles.
It had grown to my arms. I feel the fire down in me. Rockefeller music is sensible.
This shows just how important this Tennessee musician was to the band's development. The Beatles covered several Perkins songs in their early years, including Matchbox, Honey Don't, and Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby. McCartney used to perform Lend Me Your Comb in the early Beatles days. When the Beatles toured Britain with Chuck Berry in 1964, they spent the last night of the tour sitting on the floor with Perkins, sharing stories, playing guitar, and singing songs together. McCartney said Carl was still the guy who wrote Blue Suede Shoes and could never do any wrong.
Couldn't get past that line, you know. And I had a lot of the other, but that line stuck out as a stinker.
In 1981, McCartney invited Perkins to record the song Get It for his album Tug of War. Years later, in 1993, Perkins showed up at McCartney's backstage door after a concert in Memphis with his guitar in hand. The two spent an hour playing all the rockabilly songs they both loved. McCartney's company still owns the publishing rights to Perkins' songs today. 5. Roy Orbison. Coming in at number 5 is Roy Orbison, the man with the powerful voice and dark sunglasses who became one of the Beatles' greatest idols. Crying. When Brian Epstein first asked Orbison to tour England with the Beatles in 1963, Orbison responded by asking, "What's a Beatle?" He had no idea how popular they were becoming. The tour created a friendly competition between the two acts. McCartney remembered how Orbison would sit at the back of the tour bus writing songs like Pretty Woman, and it would make the Beatles jealous. McCartney said they would tell him the song was great, but they would be thinking they needed to have something just as good. This competition inspired McCartney to write classics like All My Loving on that same tour bus. John Lennon originally wrote Please Please Me as a slow, dreary song that sounded like Roy Orbison. Producer George Martin made them speed it up, and it became their first real hit. McCartney later called their time touring with Orbison a historic moment. The Beatles were scared to perform after him because he was so powerful on stage, standing completely still like marble while hitting incredible high notes. 4. The Beach Boys. At number 4 are the Beach Boys, specifically the genius of Brian Wilson, whose album Pet Sounds changed everything for the Beatles. When McCartney first heard Pet Sounds in 1966, he thought it was the album of all time and wondered what the hell the Beatles were going to do next. He said the album blew him out of the water.
Surfing USA.
McCartney was so impressed that he bought copies of Pet Sounds for each of his kids for their education in life. He believed nobody was truly educated musically until they heard that album. The bass lines on Pet Sounds particularly inspired McCartney to write more melodic bass parts for the Beatles. McCartney called God Only Knows the greatest song ever written and his favorite Beach Boys song. It inspired him to write Here, There, and Everywhere, using Beach Boys-style harmonies in the introduction. The friendly rivalry between the two bands pushed both to greatness. The Beatles' Rubber Soul inspired Pet Sounds, which then inspired Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. When McCartney performed God Only Knows with Brian Wilson years later, He broke down crying during soundcheck because the song was so emotional. He loved Wilson and was privileged to be around his bright shining light. 3. Elvis Presley. Taking the number 3 spot is Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll who changed everything for young Paul McCartney. When McCartney first heard Heartbreak Hotel in 1956, he had to go to a record shop in Liverpool and listen to it through headphones in a booth. It was a magical moment, the beginning of an era. McCartney said Elvis was so hot and they were all so in love with him. McCartney started to see pictures of Elvis, and that pulled him away from his academic path at school. He said the tingles started going up and down his spine, and the academic things were forgotten. McCartney admitted he doubted very much if the Beatles would have happened if it was not for Elvis. The Beatles finally met Elvis at his home in Los Angeles in 1965. McCartney remembered that Elvis was into the bass, which gave them a great conversation piece. Elvis was talkative, friendly, and a little bit shy. Years later, in 2013, McCartney visited Graceland for the first time and placed a guitar pick on Elvis's grave so he could play in heaven. McCartney even bought the original bass that Elvis's bassist Bill Black used on Heartbreak Hotel. 2. James Brown. At number 2 is James Brown, the godfather of soul, who McCartney called sodding fantastic. In a 2003 interview, McCartney admitted that if you stacked the Beatles up against James Brown record for record, nothing. Brown was definitely hotter because he was James Brown. McCartney respected his incredible talent even while defending the Beatles' own legacy. Brown's influence on McCartney's bass playing was huge. McCartney absorbed elements from Brown's songs like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, which helped him develop more spontaneous and melodic bass lines. The American soul music coming from artists like Brown fascinated McCartney and the Beatles throughout the mid-1960s. McCartney even used Brown as inspiration while recording. When working on songs in the studio, he would sometimes think to himself that he would sing it like James Brown might. He had little mental images of Brown during recording sessions. McCartney said there was something about Brown's showmanship and soul that was impossible to match. While the Beatles did different things than Brown, McCartney never stopped admiring the pure power and energy that Brown brought to every performance. He represented everything great about soul music. 1. Little Richard. Coming in at number 1 is Little Richard, the screaming pioneer of rock and roll who taught McCartney everything he knows. When Little Richard came screaming into McCartney's life as a teenager with songs like Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, and Good Golly Miss Molly, everything changed. McCartney said he owed a lot of what he does to Little Richard and his style, and Richard knew it. Little Richard would say he taught Paul everything he knows, and McCartney admitted Richard was right. In the early days of the Beatles, they played with Richard in Hamburg and got to know him personally. Richard would let them hang out in his dressing room and they witnessed his pre-show rituals. McCartney watched him put his head under a towel over steaming hot water, then suddenly lift his head to the mirror and say he couldn't help it because he was so beautiful. And he was. Little Richard taught McCartney his distinctive vocalizations and showed him how to scream with power and emotion. McCartney even adopted Richard's pre-show ritual of steaming his face before performances. When Richard died in 2020, McCartney thanked him for all he taught and the kindness he showed by letting him be his friend. From Little Richard's screams to the Beach Boys' harmonies, these 10 bands shaped Paul McCartney into the legend we know today. Which influence surprised you most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories about music's greatest legends.